It's the 20th of July, and I've brought you to Arbroath Abbey to continue the story of what happened to William I of Scotland on the 13th of July 1174. Now, this abbey was built by William I, and he's buried here. But if you want to understand why William was buried here, but his Canmore ancestors were buried at Dunfermline, then you'll need to watch this video. Hiya, I'm Bruce Fummey. If you're interested in the people, events and places in Scottish history, then subscribe to Scotland History Tours and click the bell symbol to be notified of new videos. In the meantime, let me tell you a story. Now, if you haven't already seen the first video in the story, or if you want to refresh your memory, then please click the link above. It'll take you back to watch that. Otherwise, let's go. So, Henry II of England has come to power after swearing an oath to David I of Scotland that Scottish kings, whose power extended into the north of England, remember, would keep the lands, titles and influence over the north of England, and there'd be no privatisation of the National Health Service. Of course, when he came to power, he said that that oath didn't apply because the oath had been sworn on the bones of a chlorinated chicken. And he was a lying git. Not only was he a lying git, but his rage had caused some of his knights to murder the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, at the altar of his church. Henry was a bad man. Becket, on the other hand, had been made a saint, and he was working miracles from beyond the grave. Now, Henry was also a superstitious bad man, and whilst he had no problem with breaking his oath to the Scots, he did think that the murder of an Archbishop of Canterbury at the altar of the church might be upsetting God a wee bit. That would explain why his sons had rebelled against him, and the French, the Flemish and the Scots had joined in on their side. The possibility that he's treated his sons appallingly and the French, Flemish and Scots were seeking political opportunity never occurred to him. The fact that he's taken back the north of England, which had effectively become Scotland, and that he's angered William I of Scotland by doing that, never even registered. So, Henry has a solution to the problems. He plans a trip to Canterbury where he'll do penance. He'll wear a nasty shirt. It'll be all hairy. It'll be horrible. To make it even nastier, he'll have it stitched with the words Dundee Football Club. Come on, the Saints. He'll crawl along the ground. He'll publicly humiliate himself all the road to Canterbury. Thomas Becket, the murdered troublesome priest, will see this from beyond the grave, put in a good word with God, and his fortunes will turn. So, Henry does the public penance. The next day, at Alnwick, an English force comes across a small group of Scots, including William I, the Lion. William jumps on his horse and he charges forward, calling, "Now we will see which of us are the good knights." The English kill the horse under him. He falls to the ground, is captured and put in chains. Aye, well, I suppose we found out who were the good knights then, Willie. What's going to happen now? William is taken in chains to Newcastle, and then he's transported all the way through England and across the Channel to a place called Filiz. It's in Normandy. Calvados apple brandy and all that. Anyway, William is forced to sign the Treaty of Falaise. Now, this is way worse than when his great-granddad Malcolm was forced to submit to William of Normandy at Abernethy. I don't know if you remember, in the first part of the story, I mentioned that William had sucked up to Henry and gone campaigning with him in France. William wanted to be seen as a gallant knight on the grand stage. But some of his nobles were unhappy about it because it made it look as if William, King of Scots, served Henry, King of England. And they didn't like the ambiguity. Now, there was no confusion. Falaise was a formal treaty, which made William a vassal of Henry, which made Scotland subject to England, which meant that Scots nobility had to swear fealty directly to Henry. Now, this meant that they were duty-bound to support Henry if William should ever break the treaty. Some of the Scots nobility were sent as hostages to be held by Henry against Scottish good behaviour. The castles of Roxburgh, Berwick, Jedburgh, Edinburgh and Stirling were to be handed over to English garrisons to keep the Scots in subjugation, but funded at Scots' expense. This was bad. It wasn't as bad as when Edward Longshanks invaded Scotland, but it was the reason he used to justify it. Let me explain. The power balance between Scotland and England had almost always been in England's favour. Now, I told you in the last episode how every time there was a new monarch, the Scots and English kings would effectively have a willy measuring competition to decide who was the boss. Well, of course, the English are massive dicks. Now everyone can put their willies away. We have it in writing. William I of Scotland had tried to gain Northumbria and he had lost Scotland. Scotland was in chains. Eventually some good news came along. You see, when Richard I, one of Henry's rebellious sons, eventually came to power, he wanted to go on crusade. You've probably heard of Richard the Lionheart, yeah? Anyway, crusades cost money, and one of the ways that he raised money was to sell Scotland back to the Scots. Some people say it's still the way they raise taxes to this day. The Scots paid Richard 10,000 merks of silver, and the Treaty of Falaise was annulled. Scotland was no longer subject to England, but for 15 years it had been. Now, after 15 years, the Treaty of Falaise had been bought out, and the money that Richard gained, he used it to go on crusade. But in spite of the treaty's annulment, English kings from that time down to Henry VIII used the fact that the treaty had existed as evidence that they had power over Scotland. I suppose more accurately, it was a martyred St Thomas Becket that had power over Scotland, wasn't it? You see, it was Henry's penance for that killing that led to William's capture. Everyone could see that St Thomas of Canterbury was the guy who was behind it. William I of Scotland built Arbroath Abbey. It took 23 years from his capture at Alnwick to the Abbey's consecration in 1197. But at its consecration, it was dedicated to St Thomas of Canterbury. It had worked for Henry, why not for William? I suppose you could say that in 1320 it finally did work for Scotland. Anyway, relics of St Thomas were brought from Canterbury, donations were made. William I of Scotland, William the Lion, never regained what is now the northern part of England. But he was one of the longest reigning Scottish kings. And as he grew older and death approached, he made more and more donations to Arbroath Abbey here. And finally, when he died in 1214, he wasn't buried with his forebears at Dunfermline Abbey, he was buried here, under the watchful eye of Thomas Becket, the martyred saint who had taken Scotland from him and given it to England. Please like, share, subscribe and click the link below to find out how to support the channel. Hamid Dochas going to be a llama alive. Cheerio and Rasta.